that's actually what the topic of the panel. So the topic of the panel was actually listed as Stanley Kubrick's Guide to Authorization, which comes from, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid you can't do that, which is probably the logical extreme to this very problem, right? If we get it right, maybe we're going to get it too right, and then you can't get in and shut down the machine. Yeah, that there's a sort of interesting overlap on that point. So let me introduce, we've met Peter already from the earlier talk, and this is Robin Wilton. On the one hand, let's see, Robin, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and why they allow you up here?
I'm on stage because there was no one to stop me. I am Robin Wilton. I work for the Internet Society. Some of you may have been in my talk yesterday about ethical data handling. Most of my work at the Internet Society is about digital identity, online privacy, and the way in which they contribute to or undermine trust. And my other hat is that I'm a partner in crime of Allan. Allan being the chairman of the Cantora initiative. I'm on the board of that and am the treasurer, for which I'm singularly ill-qualified. But they put up with me anyway. And that's kind of the same basis on which I'm on this stage. I'm singularly ill-qualified to be here, but they put up with me.
Well, the discussion that we've been having very much around the issues of privacy, and you can stand up, very much around the issues of privacy and ethical data. I mean, this is just an absolute manifestation of that exact problem. And it's sort of really interesting, your issue around data handling and privacy and your issue around devices. Here we have a sort of merging of the two, and it's coming right together. We were having a little bit of a discussion over lunch and around the issues of, what sort of things, on the one hand, there's an administrative interface to that device. There is an Alexa app that you can work on the phone, so you can administer into that. The authentication that it has is it simply needs to be on the same network as the device. So it's not particularly restrictive. But we were having the discussion around, is the administrative interface still best done over a quaint keyboard, right, some kind of browser kind of interface? And I think at the moment it probably is. However, the reality is as we move out forward, more and more of these things are going to move that way.
Well, and it's very, very confusing to most consumers. I certainly would not have any expectation that my father would understand how to make any of these policies. And there's no sort of common metaphor for how you manage security on a semi-autonomous device. And until we get there, you're going to have shoddy policy over everything.
So
I think, yeah, it's hard to sum this up really quickly, but I'll try. I look at this from the point of view of how we think about identity. And there are two ways of looking at identity. The traditional way we look at it is, how did you get a passport or a driver's license? You went through some, what Kim Cameron would call a trusted ceremony. And as a result of that, you were issued with a credential, which encapsulated some information about you. And you could then present that credential in such a way that someone could look at it and say, yes, this person is identical with the person who earlier was issued with this credential. Okay, so that's the relationship of identity that we're trying to establish. Now, as you saw from Alan's previous presentation, that doesn't happen here. There has been no process where Alexa is told in a trusted way who Alan actually is. And she has no way of comparing someone else walking up and speaking to the so-called authentic Alan. Okay, so that model of identity is clearly not working here. The new model of identity is how the internet really works, which is, well, this is going to be a good one for you. Does everyone remember Pigpen in the Peanuts cartoons? Yeah, he used to wander around in this little cloud of crud. Yeah, well, that's what happens to us with our digital footprints. We wander around in a cloud of crud. And if you collect enough of the pieces of crud, you can figure out who is at the center of it all. there's no trusted ceremony there. It's just that by aggregating enough information about you, I can figure out who is at the center of that cloud. So that's how identity works these days. But that's really hard to express, as Peter said, as a metaphor. It's hard for us to have a mental model of that we can refer to and say, yes, that's why that device thought it was me.
I'm thinking broom and dustpan.
The broom and dustpan metaphor of digital identity for the 21st century. We're really moving forward, folks.
Okay, maybe Dyson.
I'm assuming I can be heard down there. Like Alan, I rarely get asked for a mic. Talking about that trust ceremony raises something that isn't otherwise obvious. We think of that as an assurance level for the person signing the token. You know, I do a trust ceremony because I look at your license or something that says that you are you or you are vouched for. But it actually also is a point of recognition wherein the human object accepts the token. The other half of the trust ceremony is you know you're getting a driver's license or something, and that's your problem with the dust cloud, isn't it? Is you're not aware or given the opportunity to consent to or even react to the presence of all those bytes.
Right, and that's the point about the number of devices we carry around that are giving off these little pieces of data. Now, if you walk up to a door and it opens because of something that you're carrying or wearing, which happens to be emitting something, then there has been no consent step, as Jamie says. The experience has become so seamless that there is no point at which you granted consent. Consent is simply implicit. And more things that we do, especially related to the Internet of Things, happen in that seamless way. One way that I thought about it is, you know those bugs that sit on the surface of a pond and they don't sink in because they use surface tension. They put their legs out and a very little piece of weight is resting on each leg. And that's kind of how that trust model works. You're accepting many small pieces of information that aren't inherently very trustworthy in themselves, but aggregated, they're enough to identify you. And like I say, it happens seamlessly and without our consent. And that's, for me, it's a worrying aspect of the Internet of Things.
There's an interesting, so I like to focus on personal IoT spaces and consumer IoT, but to bring this into an industrial application, there's actually some very similar problems. Today, they're all kind of scapegoated into contracts, so yeah, well, you agreed to the contract, so we get your data, right? But there are some applications today where the custody of the data and actually the custody of the device moves through a continuum of ownership. So I have a sensor that I sell that's a temperature sensor again, and it's within a jet engine that GE is manufacturing, and GE sells the jet to Boeing, and the engine to Boeing, and Boeing sells the completed airplane to United. And there's actually a custody change, but not in entirety, right? So the sensor manufacturer says, I have rights to get certain amount of data out of it, up to and including status of firmware and a few other things, right? So that they can do field upgrades and whatnot of the sensor. And then it goes to GE, who says, okay, well, we're going to provide a value-added service to our customer, and so we're going to aggregate all this data off this engine, and every time the plane lands, I'm going to gobble up all that data and run it through an analysis system. And then they sell it to Boeing, and Boeing says, great, we build a plane, United, here you go. And in the end, what you have is Predix, right? Now, so Predix is stuffed with all sorts of data with a significantly varied amount of provenance around it. Some of it was Boeing's data, some of it was GE's data, some of it was United's data. And in the end, United kind of benefits from all this data sharing because GE can phone home and say, this engine needs service, shut it down. But it's the same problem. It's the same kind of, I don't really know where all the bits are flying, and so the airplane is moving around in a little cloud, as opposed to a white puffy one.
Well, and I thought Frank Abagnale's talk was fantastic in that regard. Admittedly, what he was doing, 40 years ago or so. But it was perfectly possible for him to discard one identity and take another one on. Okay, it may not be entirely legal to do that, There are cases where it is legal and indeed necessary to do it. So undercover law enforcement officers, people escaping abusive relationships, that kind of thing. But the point about the Internet of Things, with that cloud of stuff that we're constantly giving off, or the digital footprint that constantly surrounds us, without our having consented to its creation, is that you can't escape from that. It's like a spider's web that you just can't get out of. And I think that's going to change the way that we look at identity. It's already changing the way that we look at pseudonymity and anonymity online. And clearly there are problems in some cases with the way people behave when they have pseudonymity or anonymity. It can lead to bad behavior. But it is changing the way in which we think of identity and what we think of as desirable identity. And it's behind one of the most pernicious statements that, well, I saw it even today, as you probably gather from my accent, I'm not from around here. My government is trying to yet again bring in draconian legislation about data retention. And yet again, I've seen a politician say, well, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear from this system of having all your personal data collected. Well, yeah, I just don't like that. There's something badly wrong with that.
Well, not to mention you don't necessarily know what it is you need to hide.
Well, Alan needs to hide all sorts of things about his sock buying habits and why he keeps turning the lights on and off.
But I was actually referring to the digital footprint you're leaving that you're unaware of, right? That may create evidence that says that Robin is actually a murderer. Right.
And this is the so-called chilling effect. So when you hear people say, well, this total view of your life by a third party has a chilling effect, it's that actually the only way in which you could control your digital footprint in an environment where there is no consent and it's all seamless generation of this data is simply never to do anything bad.
Or maybe never to do anything at all.
I'm thinking boy in the plastic bubble.
Any thoughts or comments from everybody sitting here in the room? Questions?
I think there's a certain desire for people to split their identity, right?
Absolutely.
There's a lot of talk about let's have one identity so we can provide you better security.
Yeah.
But that assumes you trust the watchers, right?
It does, and so a couple of aspects to that. I'm always a little bit more optimistic about the oversight that happens to law enforcement than I am about the oversight that happens to, say, intelligence and national security. Because so much of that has to happen behind closed doors, I'm never quite confident that the oversight there is adequate. And that's basically what's behind the whole argument over Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield, is that the Europeans were not convinced that there was sufficient oversight on, of the activities that were happening under the national security and intelligence umbrella of that. That was a bit of a tangent, wasn't it?
It was. However, I want to come back to that and pointing to something that Robin said a couple of seconds ago, hours ago now, but a few minutes ago, and that is the trust ceremony, some trusted ceremony that happens, and the presenting of the credentials, and that the identity is basically the linkage between those two things. And there's no actual real requirement that it be a single identity. The identity is simply that linkage, and you could have many linkages between trust events and when you present the credentials, and in fact we do, right? If you think right now you have a driver's license that ties two events together, and you have a bank ATM card that ties two events together, but the driver's license and the ATM card are sort of separated in terms of what they're dealing with. Yes, it's about the same person, although they may have a different spelling of your name on it. It's not an ID on one, and there's all sorts of differences between those identities. And trying to put everything into one big unified blob of this is who you are, I think is pushing it too far. It actually is a set of separate connections.
Yes, so probably about 10 years ago or so, when the precursor to this conference, which we called Digital ID World, that was organized by a lot of the same people and a lot of the identity that you've heard talking over the last few days, talked about the concept of persona, and that you could either have coupled persona, So that was Peter, the legal Virginia resident, versus Peter, the Facebook identity, right? And I deliberately don't want to have any connectivity between, or any linkage between Peter, the state citizen, and Peter, the Facebook person. And in fact, it gets a slightly more complicated, although I've let some leakage happen over the years of, metaphorically, of the connection or the association between Facebook and LinkedIn, which is associating my private identity, my personal identity, and experiences with my employee identity, with keeping track of my CV and things like that.
I have to smile at that. Real recently on LinkedIn. So, I normally go through every morning when I'm bored, I'll look through the postings of my circle on LinkedIn. And there was a cartoon about a week ago that came up on LinkedIn, and it was somebody sitting opposite a hiring manager. And the comment from the hiring manager said, "Your LinkedIn profile shows you as a highly motivated engineer. However, your Facebook profile shows a favorite tequila and a somewhat open reaction to your body." and sort of we're looking at this, it really is two different personas that are now bleeding across, merging across. And I don't think, it's sort of interesting while you were saying that, another thought that was going through my mind was that almost without fail, every time there is something against personas or something that says we need to go to tied-in identity, it's always to prevent crime or bad things from happening, right? That we need to know what everybody's doing so we can prevent the crime. I don't believe that there's another motivation to it.
I don't think there is. But I think the important thing is to regulate the behavior, not the mechanism that gives rise, that makes that behavior possible. Because after all, the ability to maintain different personas is actually key to our understanding of privacy. I remember the first time I came home from school and my mother opened the front door and said, "I want a word with you, young man. Your teacher has said something very disturbing." And I thought, but that was at school. You adults, you adults talk to each other. And this realization dawned on me that contextual integrity was a key part of privacy. Well, I was only 6, so
worlds collide.
Yeah. Yes. So it is, and the kind of the academic work on this. There's a fantastic paper by Helen Nissenbaum about what she called contextual integrity, which is about how the things that you disclose in one context, when they show up in another context without your having facilitated that or given consent to it, you feel that the contextual integrity of your disclosure has been violated, and with it your privacy. And the other guy who did fantastic work on this was a guy who died far too early called Andreas Fitzman, who did a taxonomy of privacy in which he identified linkability as one of the core concepts. That if you've disclosed something in one context, so for example you have a speeding ticket, and you've disclosed something in another context, for example you have glaucoma, and someone links those two things across different contexts, then they're linking together things which you didn't necessarily intend to be joined together. And again, you then get contextual integrity violation and therefore privacy violation. So that was those two I think are really formative thinkers about that concept of privacy. And I think it's key to our mental models of it, even if we don't explicitly realize that.
No, go ahead.
We also talk about, pointing to biometric authentication, passwords are bad. But biometric, there are very few ways to separate things. Right? You only have one DNA, you only have one voice, you only have one virus. And therefore, being able to separate those identities becomes harder and harder and harder, because in theory they could hash your thumbprint like the FBI does, and that now becomes your as an tracking across everything. So there's almost an industry push towards making it harder to keep your privacy in the effort to assure your privacy.
So there's an interesting discussion around biometrics, and I end up getting into a heated discussion on this one fairly often.
It's not like you.
No, it's not like me at all. But there's a discussion that is biometric data an authentication mechanism, or is it a validation of an authentication? Right? And the sort of piece that comes to me is that biometrics as an authentication mechanism in itself has a couple of really interesting aspects to it that I don't see as positive. It is intentionally irrevocable. You can't change your iris, you can't change your fingerprint or something like that. So it's intentionally irrevocable and yet unintentionally revocable. I give you a nasty circular saw accident affecting your thumb. And so you have this sort of challenge where it sort of is the worst of both worlds. One of the things, I did a talk about a month back, and it was entitled "On the Death of Passwords and Where Do We Go From Here?" And much to my surprise, the talk turned out to be in defense of passwords, because one of the things about them is that A, they are easy to verify by humans, and B, they are easily changed. And all of the other kinds of things we have a look at. One of the challenges with using biometrics to actually authenticate is when it changes, it's really hard to validate, right, for whatever the nasty incident actually happens. But yes, you're right. When you come down to that, I'm waiting for the point where it comes down to, please supply a new fingerprint. You cannot use any one of the 10 you've used before. I've run out of fingerprints.
Please try toe number 1.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? That any architecture that's based on biometrics as well, and I see them as an attribute. Okay, they're just an immutable attribute. So, to my mind, any architecture where you're going to rely on them as as input to an authentication mechanism, you better have a layer of abstraction in there between the biometric data and what you store and what you validate. And that makes sense to me, because if a biometric is something inherent about my person, then that's where it belongs. It doesn't belong on a plastic card. You want to put something on a plastic card that's derived from my biometric, that's okay. I don't mind that. But don't put... They actually wanted to do this in the UK ID card scheme, to put a facsimile of my thumbprint on the chip on the ID card. And I said to them, you do realize that people can read that off and recreate my thumbprint, don't you? And he said, yeah, but we tried doing it with just a few points, diff points of the thumbprint and hashing it, and it was really hard. The hash kept changing, so we gave up on that.
And therein lies the crux of the matter, right? It was really hard. Any more questions?
So why isn't there a way to control the uses? I mean, I'm a U.S. Excuse me. Why isn't there a way to control the use cases? Because in my case, I work for a U.S. government agency, U.S. CIS. My privacy people are all over every time I want to add a jot or a tittle to whatever I'm holding on to, right? And, well, they should. It took me a little while to understand that, but, well, they should, being from an enforcement background. It's like, okay, why are we doing this? We're trying to make a system work, but for the reasons you pointed out. So where is there a control mechanism outside of the government that doesn't have the same privacy officer? I mean, the FTC can't do everything, right? I mean, so that's the question I'm sort of putting to you. Where in the processes would you put controls on the use cases and who can use them and how and what they can do with it?
So my brother, who's 5 years my elder, is as just as much a computer geek as myself, and actually likes to talk about identity problems at length. And only just a couple of weeks ago, he and I had this very conversation. And that is, okay, I understand when you're in a highly regulated execution environment that you got the right cops, boots on the ground, making sure everybody's playing by the rules, right? And you may not agree with the rules, but there are rules and you follow them, and at least you're compliant, right? Where is the equivalent boots on the ground for the common man? And you can start to, in the IoT space, for example, there are a few steps that are happening that are meaningful and relevant, but unfortunately terribly insufficient. And one of those activities is UL. UL has actually stepped in. They announced it at the beginning of this year. And they're focusing primarily on industrial applications right now. but they admitted that consumer electronics were not far away. And so there are a couple of industry sectors that they're starting with now. They don't yet know what their compliance rule set is because they're really just sort of scratching their head about it. And they do have public sessions in fora within places like the Industrial Internet Consortium where they gather feedback and say, okay, tell me what your requirements are. You know, what are your privacy requirements? What are your access policy requirements? You know, what is your fail-safe mechanism? Things of that sort. And they will test that. That doesn't necessarily, you know, again, in industrial application, privacy is less of a problem. It exists, but it's less of a problem. But the consumer, happily, is very familiar with that little U crossed with that little L. And eventually, hopefully, the little C crossed with the little A. And Great Britain has, you know, similar systems of consumer product safety. I mean, this is certification, and the EU actually has something in that regards. So, but the problem is they're never really going to test the right thing. And they're not going to test it in a holistic system, right? They're going to test that widget. They're going to test Alexa, right? They're not going to test Alexa in a room with crowded people playing Kim Kardashian TV shows and et cetera, right? And so it's a partial measure. It's a partial attempt at, you know, saving grace, but it's going to be incomplete.
Looking at the issue in terms of, okay, how do we define what those standards are? And I'm not sure that we don't know what they are until we find that they've been violated. Mainly because we don't know all of the things that can happen, right? And if you look at Facebook, which is a prime example of this, right now Facebook is being vilified by everybody on the planet. It's taking all of our data. It's making lots of money, yada, yada, yada. But 20 years ago, or maybe even 15 years ago before they came out, we weren't really even thinking that that's what we would be able to do with things. And sitting down and saying, let's write a rule book for the way Facebook should behave were there a Facebook, it sort of doesn't really make sense. And so I think as an industry, a lot of this kind of conference is where those things are brought to mind and people are looking at, you know, what is the appropriate ethical way for us to behave? And what are ways that we as professionals can look at it and say, that's across the line, I mean, that can't be done. And I think it sort of comes back to the good old community standards.
Well, I think that's a really good point. 20, 30 years ago, when the OECD guidelines on data processing were first drafted, it made sense to define personal data as lists of things, you know, name, date, so on. That has become less and less viable as a means of classifying things that count as personal data, because we can now be identified by pretty much anything. Yeah. So we need a different approach, and I think Alan's right. We need to focus on the outcomes. What are you doing with the data, and what's the impact on the individual?
Is it time to go and hear the next? Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you for coming, everybody.